Laughter echoed through the stifling air of the party room at Studio 54, where neon lights flickered like the frenzied heartbeat of the 1980s. Peter Grayson stood amidst the crowd, a glass of champagne in hand, his Armani suit clinging to him like a declaration of success. He had just turned 35 today, his birthday, and it was also the wrap party for a major project at CBS News, where he worked as a freelance image consultant, the man behind the perfect faces on screen. But now, amid the toasts and admiring glances, a sharp pain sliced through his chest like an invisible blade. He forced a smile, masking it by raising the glass to his lips, but blood was already seeping from somewhere inside. A secret he'd ignored for months. Peter wasn't the type to bow to pain easily. 3 months ago, a doctor had warned him about a stomach ulcer, handing him a pile of pills and advice to rest. He'd smirked, tossing the prescription into the trash as he left the clinic. "I don't need those damn pills," he told himself, convinced his willpower could conquer anything. Now, standing in the revelry, he felt that arrogance betraying him. The pain spread from his stomach to his chest, then down his legs. He gripped the glass tighter, maintaining a calm facade as a colleague slapped his shoulder. "Peter, you're the star tonight," the man shouted over the music. Peter nodded, but his lips trembled. Blood, he could feel it hot and wet rising within him. He turned, slipping away from the crowd, stepping out into the cold Manhattan streets. No one noticed. They were too caught up in the booze and their own glamour. He drove his Porsche 911 back to his Upper East Side apartment, hands shaking on the wheel. The city streets blurred past in a streak of light, and with every press of the gas pedal, he felt like he was racing death itself. At his doorstep, his legs gave out. Keys clattered to the hardwood floor, and he collapsed, blood pooling from his mouth, staining the expensive Persian rug he'd once bragged about to friends. "This can't be happening," he whispered, reaching for the rotary phone. His faint voice cut through the night. "Lydia, save me." Lydia, his best friend since college, arrived within 10 minutes. She screamed when she saw him sprawled there, blood soaking his suit. "God, Peter!" she cried, dragging him to her car. But when they reached the emergency room at Mount Sinai Hospital, the real hell began. Nurses eyed him coldly, whispering among themselves, "AIDS. Definitely AIDS." It was 1987, the peak of fear and stigma. They shoved him into a corner, leaving him slumped on a plastic chair, blood dripping into a puddle on the floor. Lydia shouted for a doctor, but no one listened. Peter felt his body unraveling, cell by cell, and in his last conscious moment he thought, "I'll die like a dog." Time slipped by like a fevered dream. Peter didn't know how long he'd been there. Maybe an hour, maybe a lifetime. The steady hum of hospital machines mingled with Lydia's screams and the murmurs of those around him. He no longer felt pain, only a strange emptiness, as if his soul had left before his heart stopped. Then a gentle hand touched his shoulder. He opened his eyes weakly and saw a woman, not Lydia, but a nurse with deep blue eyes and a smile warm as sunlight in winter. "You still alive, kid?" she said, her voice low but vibrant. She wore no name tag, yet Peter felt he'd met her somewhere long ago. Without waiting for an answer, she pulled him into a wheelchair, pushing through the indifferent nurses and shouted, "I need a doctor now." Her tone was sharp, brooking no argument. Within minutes, Peter was in the operating room, blinding white lights piercing his eyes. But his condition was dire. Blood poured from within, unstoppable, like a river breaking its banks. Doctors struggled to insert N4, but his veins kept bursting, blood spraying their white coats. "We're losing him," one yelled. Peter heard it all, but fear had left him. He felt himself drifting away from his body, away from the room. Then a tunnel appeared. Not the white light people spoke of, but a spinning vortex of black pulling him in. He didn't resist. He couldn't. The tunnel swallowed him, and in that moment Peter Grayson, the man who controlled everything, lost all control. He heard his heartbeat slow then stop. The heart monitor flatlined, a long monotonous beep. The doctors panicked, but he was no longer there to witness it. He had stepped into another world, one he'd never believed existed. The tunnel wasn't cold as he'd imagined. It was warm, alive, like a giant breathing creature. Peter felt weightless, free of pain, free of blood. He looked down and jolted. There he was, floating above the operating table, staring at his own pale, lifeless body surrounded by doctors like vultures. He wanted to scream, but he had no voice. He could only watch, helpless and curious. Then a force yanked him backward into the tunnel. It was a whirlwind pulling him through swirls of color, black, red, gold, until he landed in a space of blinding light. Before him were familiar faces, but not as he remembered them. There was his grandmother, who died when he was a child, her kind smile unlined by age. There was Eddie, his high school best friend, killed in a car crash at 18, now standing with the same mischievous grin. And then Mrs. Bellamy, his third-grade teacher who taught him cursive, younger, radiant, as if time had reversed. "Welcome home, Peter," Mrs. Bellamy said, her voice like a melody. He wanted to ask where home was, but before he could, a flash of light erupted and he saw numbers. No, not just numbers, equations 222 333 444, then 1111. They spun before him, accompanied by strange visions. Quantum particles colliding, space bending, time melting. Peter, who'd hated math in school, suddenly understood it all. It was as if his mind had been unlocked, as if he'd become part of the universe, grasping its secrets without explanation. But all gave way to a mix of fear and curiosity. Where was he going? Was this death? And if so, why was it so beautiful and strange? The tunnel vanished and Peter found himself seated on a tree. Not an ordinary pine or oak, but something magical, its branches shimmering like crystal. He felt no weight, no time. Before him a figure appeared. Not human, not quite an angel, but an entity of glowing light, like sunlight bent into form. "Don't be afraid," a voice said, not from a mouth but from the air itself. "You've come to look back." Look back. Peter didn't get to ask before the space shifted. An invisible screen appeared and he saw himself, a newborn crying in his mother's arms at the hospital, a 5-year-old running in a Brooklyn backyard, then a 17-year-old at high school lockers. It was his birthday, and his sister Sarah stood beside him, beaming. "Say you love me, Peter," she pleaded, eyes sparkling. But he mumbled, glancing at his football buddies snickering nearby. "Go away, Sarah," he thought, turning his back. That night, Sarah died in a drunk driving accident. He'd never told her he loved her. Tears welled in Peter's eyes, but there was no judgment from the tree or the glowing entity. Just truth, raw and painful. The film rolled on. Him at 28 driving to a CBS interview, chewing gum and flicking the wrapper out the window. He watched it drift down the Hudson River, joining a filthy stream of trash and chemicals, flowing past slums where kids swam, and later died from the toxins. One small act, a moment of carelessness, had rippled into a chain of tragedy he'd never known. "Why am I seeing this?" he whispered. The entity didn't answer directly, but he felt the response. To understand that everything matters, that every choice he made left a mark on the universe. The tree dissolved and Peter floated in a vast expanse, like a galaxy without borders. Below him was Earth, green, beautiful but scarred. Forests raised, oceans choked with garbage, cities trembling with war. He saw goodness too. A firefighter rushing into a burning building. A teacher patiently guiding a slow child. It all unfolded before him like a living painting, both wondrous and cruel. Then he arrived at a place he later called Bardo, a way station where souls were cleansed before moving on. There he met another entity, not crystalline light but a golden blaze, like millions of gold flecks suspended in space. "Peter," its voice rang out, warm enough to melt his heart. "Do you wish to go on or return?" He didn't grasp it immediately, but then he saw his future. Speaking to thousands about this experience, writing books, traveling the world, facing 2 painful years of recovery but filled with purpose. The love from that golden light was so overwhelming he wanted to stay forever. But then he thought of Sarah, the words he'd never said, the mistakes he could fix. "I want to go back," he said firmly. The light smiled. Not with a face but a feeling. And he felt himself falling, plummeting through space and light until a jolt slammed him back into his body. He opened his eyes in the hospital, weak, in pain but alive. The heart monitor beeped steadily. Doctors murmured. Unbelievable. Peter knew he'd been given a second chance. Not to live as before, but to live differently. Peter awoke to the harsh white light of the ICU at Mount Sinai Hospital. The steady beep of the heart monitor reminded him he was still alive. But his body didn't feel like his anymore. Heavy, frail, a hollow shell stuffed with pain. He tried to move his hand, but every muscle screamed in protest. A breathing tube poked his nose and 4 lines wrapped his arm like tiny chains. Where had he been? And for how long? Peter. Lydia's voice trembled beside him, laced with hope. He turned his head slowly and saw her there, eyes red from crying. God, you're awake. You've been in a coma for over 3 weeks. 3 weeks. He tried to recall, but his memories were a jumble. Blood on the rug, the spinning tunnel, the shimmering tree, the golden light. Was it real? Or just the hallucination of a dying man? A doctor entered, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a stern face. You're a miracle, Grayson, he said dryly. We thought you were gone. Your intestines ruptured. Ulcerative colitis, not a stomach ulcer like we first thought. You lost so much blood we didn't think you'd survive surgery. Peter listened, but his mind was elsewhere, drifting to those numbers, 222333, and the profound understanding of the universe he'd never had before. We need another surgery, the doctor went on, plus chemo and radiation to manage the inflammation. Without it, you won't live 3 months. His words hit like a hammer, but Peter wasn't afraid. He'd faced death, seen it, and knew something greater awaited. No, he rasped through the tube. I won't do it. Lydia gripped his hand, panicked. Peter, are you crazy? Listen to him. But he shook his head, a strange certainty flooding him. He remembered the golden light, that boundless love, and an instinct told him the doctor's path wasn't his. I know what I have to do, he said, though he didn't fully understand his own words. That night, after Lydia left and the hospital fell silent, Peter lay staring at the ceiling. Then he saw it, a faint figure at the foot of his bed. A woman about 60 in a patient gown, her eyes hollow yet glowing faintly. He blinked, thinking it was the drugs, but she remained, watching him. You see me, she said, her voice like a breeze. Peter's heart raced. Who are you? He asked. I'm Helen, she replied. I died here 3 days ago. You're the first to see me since. The next morning, Peter told Lydia about Helen, but she gave a strained smile, brushing his hair like soothing a child. You've been through a lot, Peter. It's probably the meds, she said, her tone gentle but tinged with doubt. He didn't argue. He knew she wouldn't believe, and he wasn't sure he believed himself. But as the day passed, more figures appeared. An old doctor with a white beard, stethoscope in hand, stood silently by the window. A boy about 10 in a baseball jersey huddled in the corner. They said nothing, just watched as if waiting. Peter grew afraid. He'd once been a practical man, scoffing at ghosts and the afterlife. Now he couldn't deny what he saw. On the third night, Helen returned. This time she stood closer, close enough for him to smell jasmine wafting from her. You're different, she said. You went through and came back. We feel it. He swallowed hard. We. Helen smiled sadly. Those who can't move on. We're stuck here between worlds. It began to click. His near-death experience hadn't just saved him, it had changed him, opening a door he couldn't close. He didn't just see spirits, he felt them. When Helen spoke of her death, a stroke no one caught in time, he heard her pain as if it were his own. Can I help you? He asked, unsure what he could do. Helen shook her head. Just listen. Sometimes being heard is enough. From then on, he conversed with them. Not all spoke, some appeared and vanished, but each encounter taught him more about this world. He was no longer the Peter Grayson of CBS, living for fame and money. He was someone else carrying both realms, the living and the dead. But his body remained weak. Doctors warned he'd die without surgery. Peter refused, trusting his instincts. He asked Lydia to bring herbs and vitamins, things he suddenly knew he needed, despite no medical training. You're insane, she muttered, but complied. And strangely, he began to recover slowly, painfully, but surely. 2 months later, Peter left the hospital, walking on trembling legs without a wheelchair. His lead doctor, Dr. Harris, stared at him with a mix of awe and irritation. You're my miracle patient, he said, but his tone held skepticism. Peter just smiled. He knew Harris didn't understand, and he didn't need him to. He'd saved himself, not with drugs or scalpels, but with a power he couldn't explain. Returning to life wasn't as easy as he'd hoped. His apartment was a wreck, blood-stained rugs, dust-covered furniture. Friends from CBS called, asking when he'd return, but when he shared his experience, they laughed or went silent. "You need rest," one said, pitying. Some never called back. Lydia was the only one who stayed, but even she grew distant. "You've changed, Peter," she said one night, as he described the baseball boy appearing in his kitchen. "I don't know how to keep up with you anymore." He felt alone, adrift in a world that once was his. But loneliness wasn't the worst part. The spirits were. They came more often, more demanding. A middle-aged man killed in a car crash appeared nightly, begging Peter to tell his wife he was sorry. A young girl, a suicide in the hospital bathroom, wept by his window. He tried to help, to listen, but he didn't know how to free them. Each time he felt his energy drain. He began to question, why had he come back? To live haunted by the dead? Sitting in his dark apartment, gazing at bustling New York streets, he considered giving up for the first time since waking. But then a memory from the tunnel surfaced, the golden light, that infinite love, and he knew he couldn't quit. He had to find the purpose behind it all. One winter morning, as Peter brewed coffee in his chilly kitchen, the phone rang. He picked up, and a stranger's voice said, "Peter Grayson? This is Detective John Carver, NYPD. I hear you. See things others don't." Peter frowned. "Who told you that?" "A mutual friend," Carver replied, evasive. "I need your help with a case. A murder." Peter nearly hung up. He wasn't a detective or a psychic, just a survivor trying to reclaim his life. But Carver pressed on. "This girl, Lisa Monroe, was killed in a Queens apartment. We can't find the killer. I think you might sense something." Peter hesitated, but curiosity won. He agreed to meet Carver, unaware this choice would change everything. At the scene, a rundown apartment with peeling wallpaper, Peter felt a chill. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew something was there. Then he saw her, Lisa, about 20, standing in the corner, eyes bloodied, staring at him. "Roses," she whispered. He liked roses. Peter turned to Carver. "Check if anyone connected to her liked roses." Carver eyed him like he was mad, but 2 days later he called. "We got him. A gardener with a rose tattoo on his arm." "How do you know?" Peter didn't answer. He couldn't explain that Lisa had told him, that he'd felt her presence guiding him. And when she vanished after that call, he felt an odd relief. He'd helped her move on. For the first time, he wondered if these abilities weren't a curse but a gift. After Lisa Monroe's case, Peter quit CBS. He no longer belonged to the world of lights and fame. Instead, he embarked on a new path, paranormal investigation. He didn't advertise, but word spread. Detectives, grieving families, even the curious sought him out. He traveled New York from Bronx alleys to Long Island's haunted houses, listening to spirits and helping them find peace. He didn't do it for money or glory. He did it because he felt it was why he'd been sent back, to bridge the living and the dead, to fix what he'd missed in his old life. He started a journal, documenting his experiences, from the tunnel to the tree, the golden light to the spirits he met. He didn't know if anyone would believe him, but he needed to write, like a way to understand himself. One day while writing, he smelled jasmine. He looked up and saw Helen, the first spirit he'd met, standing there after years. "You're doing well," she said, smiling. "But don't forget to live for yourself." Then she vanished, leaving him with a question. He'd come back to life, but was he truly living? By spring 1988, Peter Grayson was no longer tied to CBS News. He'd become an underground sensation among cops and the desperate in New York, a man who could talk to the dead. His reputation spread through whispers, from dingy Harlem bars to Midtown precincts. He didn't seek attention, but it found him like a wave he couldn't stop. One rainy afternoon, Detective John Carver knocked on his apartment door, a thick file in hand. "I need you again," Carver said, his voice low but urgent. "A big case. 5 dead in a Staten Island house. No clues, no witnesses. Cops think it's a mass suicide, but I don't buy it." Peter studied Carver's tired eyes, sensing he was holding something back. "Why me?" he asked. Carver sighed. "Because I heard crying in that house, Grayson. No one else did." That night, Peter entered the house on Maple Avenue, an old Victorian with cracked shingles and fogged windows. The air was heavy, as if the house itself breathed. He felt their presence before seeing them, 5 figures scattered in the living room. A middle-aged man with a scarred face, a young woman clutching a doll, twin children in pajamas, and an old woman with milky eyes. They didn't speak, just stared, their gazes piercing. "What happened here?" Peter asked, his voice echoing in the dead silence. The scarred man stepped forward, whispering, "He made us drink it. He said it was the way out." Peter's spine chilled. He turned to Carver. "This wasn't suicide. Someone poisoned them. Look for a motive tied to the whole family." Carver nodded, though his eyes betrayed doubt. 3 days later, Carver called. "You were right. We nabbed their lawyer, poisoned them for inheritance money." "How do you know?" Peter didn't reply. He couldn't explain that the scarred man's spirit had told him that he'd felt their pain as his own. But this case shifted something in him. He realized his gift wasn't just for helping spirits move on. It was for bringing justice to the living. He began calling himself the Listener. Not a psychic, not a detective, but a bridge between worlds. Peter's new fame came at a cost. Lydia, once his rock, drifted further away. One evening, she arrived at his apartment with a bottle of wine and a forced smile. "You're not the Peter I knew," she said, sitting on the sofa, twirling her glass. "You live with ghosts more than the living." He looked at her, wanting to argue, but he knew she was right. He spent hours each day writing, listening to spirits, chasing cases Carver brought. There was no time left for coffee dates or carefree chats. "I didn't choose this, Lydia," he said quietly. "It chose me." She shook her head. "You could say no. You could go back to CBS, live a normal life. But you don't want to, do you?" He fell silent. The truth was, he didn't. His old normal life felt like a distant memory, pale compared to what he'd seen in the tunnel and the tree. But he didn't know how to explain that to Lydia, who'd never seen the golden light or heard the whispers of the dead. The argument ended when Lydia stood, setting her glass down. "I can't be friends with someone who's not here," she said, walking out. The door's slam echoed, leaving Peter in deep solitude. He wondered if he was sacrificing too much friendship, family, peace, for a mission he didn't fully grasp. It wasn't just Lydia who left. His family, an aunt and a few cousins, cut ties after he shared his near-death story. "You need a shrink," his aunt snapped over the phone before hanging up. Peter didn't blame them. He knew his tale sounded insane. Tunnels, spirits, golden light, but it was his truth and he couldn't live as if it hadn't happened. In June 1988, Peter received an unusual request. Not from Carver, but from Margaret Ellis, a woman in suburban Albany. Over the phone, her voice quivered. "My house has a problem. My daughter sees something, and I don't think it's human." Peter agreed to come, unaware this trip would thrust him into a greater challenge than any case before. Margaret's house was an old farmhouse, its wooden walls rotting, the air thick with damp. As he entered, an 8-year-old girl, Emily, clung to her mother's leg, eyes wild with fear. "It's in the basement," she whispered. Peter felt a chill down his spine. He didn't need Emily to lead him. He knew something waited below. The basement was pitch black, lit only by Peter's flashlight. In the corner he saw it. Not a normal spirit, but a massive black shape, formless, with 2 red glowing dots for eyes. It didn't speak, but Peter felt its hostility, a primal rage. "Who are you?" he asked, steadying his voice. The shadow roared, a sound not of this world, and lunged at him. Peter fell, the flashlight clattering away. Pressure crushed his chest, as if the shadow was draining his life. In desperation, he recalled the golden light, its infinite love, and shouted, "Get out!" The shadow shrieked, then dissolved, leaving him gasping on the floor. Upstairs, Margaret and Emily stared in awe. "It's gone," Emily said, smiling for the first time. Afterward, Peter realized not all spirits sought help. Some were trapped by pain, others by malice. He dove deeper, reading about spirituality, demons, and the paranormal. He knew he had to grow stronger, not just for the living, but to face darkness he'd never imagined. After the basement incident, Peter changed his life. He realized he couldn't just chase spirits in cases. He needed to live for himself, as Helen had urged. He started new habits. Morning walks along the Hudson, watching sunlight dance on the water, and writing down what he was grateful for: breath, a second chance, even the pain that led him here. He no longer saw his abilities as a burden, but as part of who he was. He also took writing seriously. His journal evolved into a book, not for boasting but for sharing. He titled it The Listener, chronicling his journey from that fateful night in 1987 to finding his purpose. He didn't know if anyone would read it, but he felt compelled to leave something behind, a mark on the world he'd once overlooked. One day, a letter arrived from a small Brooklyn publisher. They'd heard of him through a friend of Carver's and wanted to meet. Peter hesitated. He didn't crave spotlight, but his gut said to go. The meeting happened in a cozy cafe, and by the end he'd signed a deal. The book would launch in fall 1989. He didn't know it was just the start of something bigger. Late 1988, Peter was invited onto Unsolved Mysteries, a special episode on paranormal cases. On screen, he recounted Lisa Monroe's case in the Staten Island house, his voice low but captivating. After airing, his phone rang non-stop, from grieving families, reporters, and skeptics challenging him. One call came from James Hartley, a physicist at Columbia University. "I saw you on TV," Hartley said. "What you said about math and quantum physics in your near-death experience, it aligns with my research on consciousness in the universe. We need to talk." Meeting Hartley opened a new door. Peter explored the link between science and spirituality, attending seminars, and even co-authoring a paper with Hartley on consciousness after death. Not everyone welcomed him. Some called him a fraud, others sent threats. Peter didn't care. He knew his truth and his mission: to spread the message of love, connection, and responsibility he'd learned from the Golden Light. He began speaking at small conferences, sharing his story with those willing to listen. Each time he took the stage, he felt closer to why he'd been sent back. By 1990, Peter Grayson was no longer obscure. The Listener became a surprise hit, selling tens of thousands of copies and translated into 3 languages. He wasn't just the listener in the shadows, he was a speaker, a paranormal investigator, and a symbol of hope for those who'd lost faith. His talks drew hundreds, from small New Jersey halls to Yale's grand auditoriums. One October evening, Peter stood on stage at the Boston Convention Center, lights bathing his face, thinner now but his eyes blazed with life. Before him sat 500 people, silent, waiting. "I once thought life was about fame and money," he began, his voice resonating through the mic, "until I died and came back. I saw a world where love is everything, where every act matters. I'm here to tell you, you don't need to die to learn that." He spoke of that night in 1987, the tunnel, the tree, the golden light. He shared Sarah's story, his regret for unsaid words, and the spirits who'd guided him to a new purpose. As he finished, the crowd stood applauding, some in tears. An elderly woman approached, hugged him, and whispered, "Thank you. I lost my son, but you make me feel he's still here." Peter smiled, sensing the golden light in moments like these. But the glow didn't last. Outside, protesters gathered, waving signs. "Grayson is a fraud, and spirituality is a scam." They pelted his car with eggs as he drove off. Peter wasn't angry. He'd grown used to doubt, but he wondered if he was on the right path. He wanted to change the world, but the world didn't always want to change. In December 1990, an unsigned letter arrived. "Think you got away, Grayson? I know the truth about you." Peter frowned, puzzled. Then tabloids erupted. Peter Grayson, con man or madman? They dredged up his past, his arrogance at CBS, broken relationships, and claims he'd fabricated his near-death story for profit. One reporter interviewed Lydia, now a successful TV producer, who said, "Peter was my friend, but I don't know him anymore. Maybe he needed the attention." Her words cut like a knife. Peter called her, voice shaking. "Why do you say that?" Over the phone, she replied coldly, "Because it's the truth I see, Peter. You live in a world I don't get, and I'm tired of trying." The call ended in silence, shattering their friendship's last thread. But that wasn't all. One morning, Carver called. "Bad news," he said. "Victor Malone just got out of prison. He's the guy who killed Lisa Monroe, your first case. He knows about you, and he's not happy." Peter's blood ran cold. He'd never met Malone, but he knew the man was dangerous, Not just a killer for money, but for pleasure. That night, as Peter wrote in his apartment, a brick smashed through his window. A note tied to it read, "You'll pay, Grayson." He called the police, but he knew this wasn't just a legal matter. He felt another presence. Lisa Monroe, her bloodied eyes watching him. "He's coming," she whispered, then vanished. Peter realized he faced not just a living enemy, but the darkness he'd once subdued. Victor Malone struck on a rainy night in January 1991. Peter was alone when a knock sounded, not loud but menacing. He opened the door, and there stood a hulking man, face scarred, eyes icy. "You're the bastard who put me away," Malone growled, brandishing a switchblade. Peter had no time to react. Malone charged, knocking him to the floor. The struggle was silent, deadly. Peter, weakened by his past illness, fought back. He recalled the golden light, the strength that brought him back, and resisted. Malone stabbed his shoulder, blood gushing, but Peter grabbed the man's wrist, wrenching the knife free with all his might. In that moment, he saw Lisa behind Malone, her eyes blazing. "Don't be afraid," she whispered, and a surge of energy coursed through him. He shoved Malone down, the knife clattering away. Police arrived soon after, alerted by a neighbor's call. Malone was arrested again, but Peter lay bleeding on the floor. Rushed to the hospital, he slipped into a haze, seeing the tunnel again, not pulling him in but a reminder. He heard the golden light's voice. "You've done enough." But he murmured, "Not yet. I've got more to do." He survived, the wound leaving a long scar on his shoulder. Doctors called it his second miracle. Peter knew it wasn't a miracle. It was will, love, and the mission he carried from beyond. After the attack, Peter stepped back from the public eye. He moved to a small house outside Albany, where birdsong replaced New York's horns. He still wrote, still aided spirits who sought him, but quietly. He didn't need stages anymore. He needed peace to process what he'd been through. One day, he received a letter from James Hartley, the physicist. Enclosed was a new paper, Consciousness and Life After Death, a perspective from near-death experiences. Hartley cited Peter's story as evidence that consciousness might transcend the physical. "You've changed how I see the universe," he wrote. Peter smiled, feeling a quiet pride. He also sought to mend his past. He wrote Lydia, not expecting a reply, just to say, "Thanks for being there when I needed you most. I don't blame you for leaving." No response came, but he felt lighter. He'd learned not everyone could walk his path, and that was okay. Spirits still came, but he set boundaries, no longer letting them drain him. He lived in both worlds, physical and spiritual, but chose to embrace each moment, from sipping morning coffee to watching sunsets over fields. In fall 1992, Peter stood before a small group in Albany, not hundreds but fellow near-death survivors. He shared his story not to inspire but to connect. "We're not here to fear death," he said, voice steady. "We're here to live truly, kindly, with love. Every act, no matter how small, is part of the universe." He ended with a question. "What will you do today to make the world better?" No one answered right away, but he saw their eyes light up, as if they'd found something within. As he left, an older man took his hand, saying, "You reminded me I can still love, even after losing everything." Peter nodded, feeling the golden light in those words. He didn't know how much time he had left. He no longer feared death. He'd seen it, embraced it, overcome it. But he knew he'd leave a legacy. Not books or fame, but a message of love and connection. He kept writing, collaborating with Hartley on science and spirituality, and aiding lost spirits when they needed him. One morning, walking by the river, he smelled jasmine. Helen appeared beside him after years. "You've done well, Peter," she said, smiling. "Now live for yourself." He nodded, and as she faded, he looked to the sky, feeling the boundless love from the golden light. He knew he'd found his purpose, not just to listen but to live,